Welcome. This is, in case you thought you tuned into something else, this is the ALS conference, and the subtitle, as we were just remarking, our panelists were just remarking, is The Power of Words. So words do matter, and we'll have a lot of them for this next hour and 15 minutes. Delighted that you could make it. This is the Antitrust and Economic Regulations section. And our topic today, perhaps not surprisingly, but not prophetically, is crisis. So we have a few. If you look at the front page of your newspapers, as I did today, the New York Times says, Biden vows swift response to collision of crises. Now, perhaps he was not talking about antitrust law, but the crises that we have actually have affected and will continue to affect the things that we examine in antitrust. And hopefully antitrust will play a part in resolving them, perhaps, or at least getting through them. So as I had written for the description of the panel, we're going to look at how antitrust law has responded to and been affected by crisis. And COVID-19 is only the most recent one. As we all know, antitrust law was adopted at a time of economic crisis in the 1890s as perceived. Antitrust law has been challenged by wars, depressions, recessions. Through each of these times, there's been a challenge to evaluate the things that we look at: merger standards, cartel and collaborative agreements, individual firm pricing decisions. What may have changed over time, particularly, is not so much crisis, but the fact that antitrust has now spread around the world. So the issues that we've focused on in the United States are now faced globally. And we are, of course, in the middle of a global pandemic and in a global economy. So the panelists today that we're going to hear from and then have pose questions to and have discussions with are going to look at crises from 4 different perspectives. So I'll do a quick introduction of our panelists, and then they're going to give a presentation about 5 to 7 minutes. We'll then follow that with questions from all of you. We hope to make this as interactive as possible. I can't see any of you, so I can't call on you, which would really replicate the way we like to do business, but hopefully you'll all participate in the chat function. So our first speaker is going to be Barak Orbach, professor of law at the University of Arizona. Forgive me, those of you, there's always a temptation to say, well, they're all well known to you, but there may be people who are signed on who are not antitrust aficionados. So Barak's work is, I would call, eclectic and very interesting, teaching not just in the antitrust area, but in the corporate area. Done wonderful pieces on the motion picture industry, on con men. And before coming to the United States, had been an advisor to the Israel Competition Authority. Our second speaker is Oke Odudu. He is on the Faculty of Law at Cambridge. I apologize to our fourth speaker, who is from Cambridge, but Oke is from the real Cambridge in England. We just have the second one here in the United States. He is a fellow of Emmanuel College, deputy director of the Center for European Legal Studies, widely published on issues of EU competition law. And we're not going to talk maybe about his own crisis, which we call Brexit, but that's another crisis. Our third speaker, my colleague Eleanor Fox, a Walter Derenberg professor of law at New York University. The recipient of this section's Lifetime Achievement Award in 2017. And Eleanor keeps achieving even after getting the Lifetime Achievement Award. So apparently on her second lifetime. She has just recently published a book with Morbar Koum, Making Markets Work for Africa. And she truly brings a global perspective to our discussion. Our fourth speaker from the other Cambridge, Nancy Rose, Charles Kindleberger, Professor of Applied Economics and former department head at MIT Economics Department. Again, as many of you know, former DAG for Economic Analysis, the Antitrust Division in the Obama administration, written about numerous topics involving economics and antitrust, and including a recent paper with Eleanor and my colleague Scott Hemphill on merger policy. So we're going to hear from each of the panelists now in the order in which I mentioned, and then our discussion will pick up threads from their presentations. So I turn it over to you, Barak.
Thank you, Harry. So generally speaking, when we talk about crises that have relevance to antitrust, typically they come with large-scale market disruptions because that's the framework of antitrust. So my comments here are mostly about that context, and by way of reference, market disruption would be about change in the organization of economic activities. This is what Justice Beckham described in Trans-Missouri, a great and extended change in the manner or method of doing business. And Justice Beckham observed that when that happens, or such situations are accompanied by distress and perhaps ruin, affecting some of those who were engaged in the old methods, which he referred to small dealers and wealthy men. So I try to cover three themes. One is the enforcement practices that we have in the US related to large-scale disruptions. Second is the unique characteristics of COVID. And third, some observations about the likely implications of COVID to antitrust. But I'll start with two preliminary comments. One is that, of course, there are many types of disruptions or crises, but it is, for the purpose of antitrust, typically it is useful to distinguish between disruptions that are triggered by exogenous shocks and disruptions that are triggered by more endogenous shocks. And so exogenous shocks would be a pandemic or a war. Endogenous shocks would be a massive market crash, such as 1929 and 2008, or technological disruptions. And one thing about them is that until COVID, the diffusion of technologies was perhaps felt fast, but it was relatively quite gradual. So these disruptions were more slowly. The second is that the competition policy is a critical element of liberal democracies. There are competition laws in non-democracies or weak democracies, but they're not particularly compatible. And I think it's important to mention that because our democratic institutions and values are not particularly strong now. So antitrust in the period in crisis, just practices. In the first half of the 20th century, the United States partially suspended antitrust 3 times during World War I, the Great Depressions, and World War II. And these suspensions drew attention mostly, or focused attention mostly, on the National Industrial Recovery Act that created the framework for collusion in industries. And that created some kind of a consensus that suspensions in period of crisis are really bad and tend to inflate collusions. And to some extent, these convictions were useful because we now have strong concerns about that antitrust will be suspended in period of crisis. And we have some practices addressing that. Generally speaking, what enforcement agencies are focusing is on accommodation of collaborations needed to address the crisis, while making strong statements that antitrust is not suspended. So this is the general pattern. It can be described more in more detailed fashion. One thing that we do not have actually a lot of studies is what happened to antitrust after crisis. Typically, the recovery comes with many antitrust implications, such as collusion when you have biddings on distressed assets, etc. And in the United States, we have several features of that. One was that the failing company came after the recovery of World War I. We had the wave of enforcement after the Great Depression, and we had fear that the economic power had impact on the democracies after World War II because of issues related to Germany, the way that Hitler went to power. Now, in the context of technological disruptions, which typically follow others, it can be independent, but typically come with others. In theory, in antitrust, we really like them. In practice, we really struggle with them, and we don't do well. First, we do not have any policies or decent policies intending to close technological gaps, that is to facilitate the diffusion of technologies. The second is that we do not really have good policies, or we mostly have debates about how to identify anti-competitive policies of disruptors. Disruptors by nature do not ignore rules, including antitrust rules, so we do not do that well. And the third one is that when we have new companies that are large, these are kind of shining objects that allow attention seekers a lot of political power, whether these are commentators or politicians. This is really wonderful, and we have tons of that. Now, in terms of the unique characteristics of COVID, we have identified just for here. One is that the pace of disruption is unprecedented because of the interconnectedness that we have. That's somewhat an aspect of technology. The scope of COVID will not be nearly as large as prior massive pandemics, but the pace is significant. The second, this is the first pandemic that will be resolved with innovation, that is the vaccines. The third is that this is the COVID led to probably the first technological leap in history. As I said earlier, technological change typically is gradual. Now we were forced to have a leap. Overnight, we had to change. And the reason is relatively simple, because changes are costly and there are objections to changes. So we had that. And the last thing that is related is that already before COVID, we had a lot of attention to disruption risk. This has been the hottest topic in corporate governance. It's more or less since 2016. So we had a lot of thinking about what is done and how to address disruptions or disruption risk. And what we do know is that there must be some kind of centralized risk management function of the government, which we do not have. That is, corporations, private entities can do it well, but we need some government for coordination. We don't have that. In terms of implications, first, one thing that I think that we do know, or COVID helped us to understand, is that even though we glorify innovation and dynamic aspects of antitrust, our approach to dynamic nature of markets is very intuitive and not particularly sound. That is, we do not really know how to deal with that, and we do not have policies to figure out how to mitigate the cost of disruptions. So this is one thing. One element of that is that legal analysis builds on distinctions and definitions, which are not really good for changes. Economic analysis is slightly better, but still build a lot on incorporates a lot of definitions. The second is that economic hardship caused by disruptions empower radical claims, whether they are left or right, and we have too much of that still now. The third is that what we are going to have is, or we already have, is a massive migration from physical to virtual venues. And we have been in this process for a long time, since the mid-1990s, but we moved forward. That would be the leap, totally forward. And the most significant aspect is that right now we have collaborative activities in virtual venues, something that we did not have before, and this conference is an example. So in terms of certain projections, the digital platform become far more dominant post the pandemic, among other reasons that the platforms will be needed to facilitate activities in virtual venues. I think that we understand that they will be regulated. We don't know how. The second is that the market arrangements post-pandemic will be much more flexible and fluid than they used to be. For example, we'll have more, the labor arrangement will be more fluid, the utilization of space will be more fluid. This will create considerable challenge for legal analysis because, again, we use definition and classifications. And in antitrust, it will create significant problems such as how do we define markets, or the distinction between integration and contracts. The third one is The third one is that price and quantity will not be particular. We already have seen decline in the focus on price and quantity. In a world where we have information, or the information is a valuable thing, we need to think about other things such as matching mechanisms and the ability of some companies to manipulate choices and preferences, which would be much more significant for market clearances. And the last thing is that what we do now understand much better is that competition can considerably increase disruption risks. That's something that we knew already before. Now we understand better. But if we have centralized risk management, competition can reduce the cost of mitigation measures. So as far as antitrust is concerned, we are kind of indifferent to that, but it's important to recognize that if other regulatory elements addressing disruption risk are improper, market competition has serious negative effects, and we have seen that in terms of preparedness. So I'll stop here.
Okay, you're on mute.
Sorry, you're waiting for me. Okay, so the context of the crisis within the UK, or if I could describe the crisis in the UK, it stems from the government response to the pandemic. So I wouldn't describe the crisis as the pandemic itself, but the government response to the pandemic. And so the government response is, to characterize the response, is to simply say, stay at home. And it's the requirement to stay at home which is causing a substantial and rapid change in these pre-existing patterns of demand. At the same time, I would just say that when the government says stay at home, it's not clear it's saying stay at home for 10, 15, 18 months. So there's something about the government response is also temporary, at least at the time it issues it. It appears to be saying stay at home for a week or two, stay at home for maybe a month, but it's not in a long period of time. So how does the economy respond when the government has said stay at home, and it appears to be giving an indication of a week or two? But this changes the way that consumers demand and the way that consumers' demand is being satisfied. So the first crisis is a reduction in demand, This reduction in demand is people are not eating out, and people are not meeting each other for coffee. There's a large part of the economy, which you may think are lattes and cappuccinos, which is predicated on people leaving their home. This has a huge impact on the economy. Okay, so there's a reduction in demand. At the same time, there's an increase in demand. People are now at home when they are not used to being at home, so they need lots of things in their home. Not only is there this increase in demand, there is some concern, not merely Brexit related, that how you might respond to the pandemic is to close borders. And as Brexit had illustrated, is when borders close, if you're an island nation, you might run out of supply. So people panicked and they were stockpiling a number of items. And prior to the government saying stay at home, there was a concern that they might say stay at home. So again, people panicked. Helpfully, the Prime Minister kept coming on the television and saying, do not panic, which of course induced much further panic. So there is reduced demand and increased demand from the same measure. So a question I have at this stage is, if antitrust responds, does it respond in the same way to an increase in demand and a reduction in demand? How do you deal with a surplus and how do you deal with shortages? Okay. So in relation to the reduced demand, the problem here appears to be, how do you deal with orderly exit? How do you deal with firms that need to exit the economy? Or, as appeared to be the case, how do you prevent exit, which might be costly, if you're anticipating demand will rapidly return? Noting that when we're saying stay at home, it is in no sense clear that you're saying stay at home for a year. Seems to be stay at home for a while. So just on this point specifically, there was an issue in dairy where a lot of dairy is for cappuccinos and people going to hotels and ordering a coffee. And so there's an environmental consideration of how do you dispose of all of this milk, because you apparently cannot just pour it into the watercourse because this leads to environmental damage. So you need some collaborative exercise or enterprise to work out what to do with all of this dairy. One of the things you can do with it, you can dry it and make powdered milk to use as additive for foodstuffs, but to get it into that distribution channel is going to take some time, and it's not that clear how long this event will go on for. But so there's one thing about orderly exit or preventing exit for some capacity that you might need in the coming weeks and months. But there is also this, how do we ensure that the situation is not exploited in relation to the increased demand? So you might think about some price gouging, but how do we also ensure continuity of supply? And so the main concern or interest had been this continuity of supply or security of supply problem, because the claim had been that in a situation where an economy requires more, there's insufficient demand, that the market cannot satisfy it. Rather than competition being the way that you would ensure this increase in demand, the firms needed to collaborate. Okay, so in this situation, rather than the market satisfying demand, collaboration, cooperation, coordination would be required. And so in order to keep the stock shelves, supply chains resilient, competition and competition law needed to be suspended. Okay, and that's really one of the claims that comes from this. I suppose at this stage, it's probably worth highlighting one of the things I draw from this is the culture of compliance that actually existed. What didn't happen was firms just went off on their own and collaborated. The firms put their hands up and said, we would like to do something, but we can't do anything. We won't do anything unless we've had our competition law clearance. So this was an unusual situation where there's ex ante consideration. So we don't get to rake over the coals afterwards, say, is it a good or a bad thing? Nobody wanted to infringe competition law. And that appears to be very clear at the outset, even in a pandemic situation. So we're trying to keep supply chains resilient, and the firms are saying competition is not going to generate the outcome that you want. So we've got some panic buying, the shelves being cleared, and they agree to, the firms, retailers or grocery suppliers, agree to suspend competition in a number of specific and limited ways. This is, of course, a famous government phrase that we used when we were deciding that we were going to not comply with international law in relation to Brexit. So in a limited and specific way, that stock competition was suspended. What you normally have in grocery retailing is everything that you want when you want it. This is suspended. Stores would now not open 24 hours a day. They would have limited opening times, and they coordinated on when they would be open. Okay. At the same time, you cannot have everything that you wanted. There would be, I hesitate to use the word rationing, but there would be limitations on how much of specific items. Ordinarily, it appeared to be centered around pasta, tinned goods, paracetamol and toilet paper, there would be a limit, and they would each agree on the limit on what you could buy. Okay? So stores are opening for a shorter period of times, and there's a limit on what you can buy. And this is going to enable the firms to smooth out demand. Okay, so the market is not going to respond well. The firms cannot, under conditions of competition, respond. They need to cooperate and coordinate. Okay, all of this is explained to government. Okay, so again, the situation is not that the firms are secretly clandestine, cartelizing, as in the classic situation. They explain transparently to government what they want to do. Government then suspends the operation of competition law, issues statutory instruments, legislative instruments that say, in relation to the things that the firms have come forward to say are necessary in order for them to ensure continuity of supply, competition law will not be applied. Okay, standard. One of the questions or concerns about that response was, who would be objecting to these wonderful measures? Of course, one of the things that's happened is you're able to exclude some firms from the marketplace. When you've agreed on standards or agreed on what you will stock in order to use your limited distribution capacity, some firms are not getting the perhaps frivolous goods into the marketplace. Okay, so you're agreeing to boycott their goods in order to prioritize some other goods. One of the things that would happen in relation to toilet roll, about to be the most studied market on the planet, no doubt, is that there appeared to be over 70 types of toilet paper available for serving all sorts of curious consumer demand. What you're able to do is limit the range to around 20 types of toilet paper, thus excluding from the market all of the choice variety that you'd previously seen that competition had generated. And it's not that clear when or whether that will come back. And so the final point I would make then is we have competition law and competition, which was suspended to ensure this continuity of supply. And this is temporary. A question first is, if the market serves you well, why does market principles need suspending? And if collaboration works well, why is the collaboration not the normal way of doing things? And my third point I would say is, when we get back to normal, how do you get rid of the impacts or effects of this period of suspension, which was designed to be temporary, which in my mind, people's mind appeared to be 3 or 4 weeks, over by Easter. I didn't realize they meant next Easter or maybe the Easter after. It appeared to be over by the coming Easter, but now maybe the next Easter. And so what measures are in place to get the economy back to normal or on a stronger and surer footing? On that point, I hand perhaps back to Harry or perhaps to the next speaker.
Okay, thanks, Oki. And hello, everybody. Good to be here. What I'm going to do in my little bit of allotted time is the following. I want to talk about perceptions about antitrust and its scope and limits. And this will include perception of antitrust is impotent in crises and perceptions of antitrust is an obstacle in crises. So I'm going to start with 4 observations along those lines. Then I'm going to tell a little story about how this particular crisis, COVID, unfolded in a way relevant to antitrust, and then a couple of conclusions. So to begin, my 4 observations. The crisis unleashes temporary market power to exploit. So antitrust is seen by so many people as impotent to control this newly unleashed market power that is exploiting them and hurting them. Number two, antitrust as an obstacle. So this is the other end. I mean, the first end would be the vulnerable people who are hurt and may need help. The second end is antitrust as not being the solution, but actually standing in the way of good solutions of the sort that both Oki and Barak mentioned, that more coordination than antitrust allows. So antitrust as an obstacle to needed coordination to bring necessities to the people. The third is, somewhat ironically, this is about developing countries. And it is about an advantage, a comparative advantage of developing countries, which usually and do have a flood of disadvantages. The developing countries law offers both the necessary flexibility to control temporal market power, such as gouging violations, flexibility to define market power in a way that's good perhaps for the moment and not to be bound in by the neoclassical definitions. And on the other hand, it also offers in their laws, which usually contain a public interest aspect, a room for a public interest justification legitimately built into their own law. And the West has criticized developing countries for just these qualities that make them better able to handle needs of the crises legitimately within their own systems. So this is number 4. Good antitrust, consistently enforced and not captured by laissez-faire, moderates sharp edges of crises. It is an unsung hero, but it's not seen and it's sidelined. And the perception of antitrust is impotent or antitrust is obstacle are forefront to everyone but us. Now, let me just say a little bit about the story of how this crisis has unfolded and the responses, and then just come back really quickly to the conclusions. Obviously, when the crisis started, we experienced great scarcities of essentials everybody needed, including masks, gels, ventilators, and hospital beds. Never mind that, some of you know, in the United States, we might have had a more vibrant market and availability of ventilators, for example, because it was noted, just as one example, that a company called Covidian that made ventilators took up over a company called Newport that had just ended into a contract with the federal government to supply ventilators at 1/3 of the price, and they were easy to use. And right after the takeover, Covidian, one of the leading companies, dropped the contract, got out of the contract. So that was one, the scarcity of essentials and the fact that the market wasn't fit for providing them just through normal market processes. Number 2, just the phenomenon, the economic phenomenon, this was mentioned already, a tsunami shift to digital. So markets shifted to digital wherever they could. Learning for students, work at home if you can. Small and middle-sized businesses shut out by the fact that they weren't providing digital services, they were providing in-store services, which were no longer possible. Children, and I want to refer to developing countries, but this is true in US too. Children in the least developed countries, I should say people in the least developed countries, only 1 in 5 have access to the internet, and most of them do not have the capabilities of buying and selling on the internet. And the small businesses have much need for capabilities before they go onto the internet. This means, and it's part of a broader theme, Crises hit the vulnerable the most. They're shut out. They need more access. They're more likely, if they have any say in their competition law, to be thinking of inclusiveness and access as a major value of the competition law, but of course, hard to satisfy. And then number 3 of this triumvirate is nationalism. And here's just one example. Trump orders 3M to stop supplying masks to the non-American market. Although 3M had contracts and it was en route to supplying Latin America and Canada with the masks, and Trump said, you can't do it. That's just an example of the nationalism. The countries, and especially the rich countries, want what they make for themselves. Understandably, they want to serve their people. But this is just another point in the bigger picture that the vulnerable, which would be developing countries, get the least and the short end of the stick, and the whole world gets a shorter end of the stick when nationalism triumphs over cosmopolitanism. So let me now just mention a couple of the responses to what should antitrust do? What should the antitrust authorities do? And so this is March, April, little in May, mostly April. The world organizations, I just mentioned ICN and OECD, came out with statements. ICN said competition agencies should accommodate necessary collaboration where it is necessary and proportional to the extent that their laws permit, and they should definitely continue to enforce the laws. There may be cartels, for example, they should be enforcing. OECD added, monitor price spikes, coordinate with consumer protection, clarify to business how you are going to analyze, and include in any of your guidance and guidelines that any cooperation that's allowed that would otherwise be illegal is legitimate to cure the crisis, necessary to meet the crisis, and time-bound. Helpful advice. So what do the various jurisdictions do? Jurisdictions around the world do various things, some consistent, some a little different from one another. A number start with exemptions or relaxations. Okay, mentioned some exclusions. ACCC, Australia, actually was the country with the biggest exemptions and suspensions. It suspended for a short time, suspended antitrust from application in a handful of named industries or markets, including banking, hospitals, telecom, energy. And if you follow the law on inequality and overconcentration, these are exactly the areas where the researchers are pinpointing and saying not all markets are overconcentrated, but there are several. These are the ones. A number of countries adopt specific price gouging laws. A number of countries adopt price caps. A number of countries say we're not going to be able to do merger control for a while. We're actually suspending filing. We'll get back as soon as we can. A number of countries bend rule of reason analysis if they don't have public interest in their law. Some countries will give exemptions to help the worst off who are trying to survive, and Brazil did this, which allowed the whole beer industry to get together to help fund their outlets, which are the beer retailers, in a joint venture called STAR. A number of them have guidelines useful to business, and a number of them say at least that they're going to monitor any collaborations that are allowed that would otherwise not be allowed. South Africa is very notable for a decision it made in a very interesting case on price gouging by a 5% firm called Babelehi, which had a lot of mass that it just happened to have. And it raised the price 888%. And the commission investigated, sued, and it went up through the courts. And very interesting case to watch, because in the end, the Competition Appeal Court said, we know this company had market power. It had substantial market power. Even under the abusive dominance law, it met the test in this very unusual case, not necessary to define the market. We can see that it has market power. So flexibility on exploitation to help the most vulnerable. And saying, for one thing, durability should not be the controlling factor in a case like this, because the market won't work within the period of time that is necessary to get the essentials to the people. And also, on a very different end, the US Business Review letter to Eli Lilly, Amgen, and 4 other big pharma companies trying to make the vaccine that sought to be able to collaborate and share a lot of information with one another about manufacturing facilities, raw materials, and supplies. And our Justice Department goes through the various facts presented and looks at markets where there could be collusion, where these companies compete, where they don't yet compete, goes through all of them and says, well, basically, you know, when we do our rule of reason analysis and the effects test, and the companies are saying, we're trying to bring the vaccine to market earlier. Justice Department says, okay, subject to some conditions. However, the analysis is actually a very conservative analysis. Might it have smuggled in more and anchored more laissez-faire economics and antitrust that might have or hope to have a more lasting effect when the crisis is over? And note also, who did bring the vaccine to market first? It's not any one of those 6 companies. All right, a conclusion, because my time is up. That was just sort of a background of the situation and the response. In this crisis period, the market doesn't work fast enough to fix the problem. It means that either the problem isn't fixed, or there is a need for government intervention, including a need for the government to say more business collaboration, more government power, more business power, because the competition isn't working fast enough. A main public problem that the people see is distribution as opposed to allocation. Of course, we're worried about allocation and invention, and we need to get more masks, more ventilators, more everything that's essential. But in the meantime, the people say we're being exploited by this new power, and traditional allocative efficiency antitrust is impotent to address that problem. And for those who think that an injustice is done, it's not doing justice. And many think it's not being done, but it's still impotent in that respect. Number 2, antitrust is an obstacle. Many people, and I'm not talking about experts here entirely, saying just antitrust just is sport. It ought to get out of the way. And sometimes it is necessary to get out of the way, but sometimes it is getting out of the way too fast. And we are promoting those collaborations exactly in the industries where we're saying they are the ones causing more inequality and causing more inefficiency and actually causing prices to go up. And this could be a legacy. And then number 3, to repeat what I said before, good antitrust consistently applied is a palliative, and it's necessary, and it's part of the environment. Just think of the counterfactual. We know that. We know it's a necessary part of the environment, but no one sees it but us. Thanks.
Good morning for at least another 15 minutes. I'm delighted to be on this panel. It's an impressive group of antitrust scholars. I'm kind of new to this game, and also the sole economist in the group. And what I'm going to do is take advantage of my position at the end, at least of the initial remarks, to not repeat things that have been said by others. I might touch on a few that I want to highlight. But to talk a little bit more about some of the economic concerns that I have in a sort of very near-term concern about what antitrust enforcement needs to be thinking about as we continue to struggle through this crisis and hopefully emerge soon from it. So as has been said, both the pandemic itself and the associated shutdowns, and I think to some extent, those are somewhat separable in the sense that even if we didn't have shutdowns, the pandemic would have caused a lot of dislocation. But those have increased the stress on many firms, particularly in some sectors that were already under a lot of pressure and stress, like bricks and mortar retail, which has been struggling for years, or sectors that were hit particularly hard given the nature of this crisis, such as travel and hospitality, restaurants, gyms, movie theaters, the type of activities that that Barak and Oke mentioned, involved sort of socialization or social activities. So the good news is, if we were having this panel several months, 6 months ago, we might have speculated about a number of near-term problems that seem not to have materialized, at least not to the extent that one would have predicted. So I think in the early spring, there was great alarm that we would have an unprecedented number of bankruptcies. Overall business bankruptcy rates in 2020 were flat or even slightly down, and seemed to be more common for firms that were experiencing financial stress prior to COVID. Part of that may be firms are just waiting to see whether they can come back through when the economy starts to open back up. Some is that at least in the US, the early stimulus package probably helped. And some of those changes in how demand was allocated and pivots by firms probably helped. But we do think there will be some potentially substantial tick up in bankruptcies as we move into 2021. There's some recent economic papers analyzing this, suggesting that we may see catch up in that dimension. Merger and acquisition activity was down in 2020, reflecting, again, a very sharp drop during the early months of the pandemic, but it shows signs of roaring back, particularly in 2021, as many cash-rich, typically larger companies look for possible bargains among potential targets. And that type of effect, the bankruptcy effect or M&A, can have a direct effect on market competition just by reducing the number of competitors in firms. But I want to talk a bit more about some competitive threats that are beyond this obvious, or what would be obvious if we observe it, decline in the number of viable businesses. So the first I want to highlight is a concern about whether the big grow bigger. We've seen a lot of academic research, including by my colleague David Otter and others, that's documented the rise of superstar firms whose productivity has enabled them to capture an increasing share of both revenue and profits, while at the same time reducing the labor share of income over recent decades. The tech firms are frequently cited as examples of this, firms like Amazon, Apple, Google, Facebook, and the like. But Otter and his co-authors show that this phenomenon extends beyond sectors that aren't specifically tech sectors. So in the hard-pressed retail industry, for example, Walmart, Target, Home Depot, Costco, companies like that have enjoyed very substantial increases in sales in 2020 and in their market share, pulling further ahead of smaller competitors. So I think we have to worry about potentially these large firms getting even bigger. Why is that happening? I think part of it is that many of these firms are particularly well positioned through investments in IT, logistics and supply chain management, things like this, that not only enable them to better survive the current crisis and to pivot to the kind of digital interaction with consumers that some of my colleagues on this panel have discussed, but to take increased share from rivals. And I think logistics expertise and access to sophisticated logistics may be one of the most prominent drivers of differential success amid the crisis in a number of sectors, not just the retail sector. So the way this gets compounded then is that these larger firms, by generating greater profits, greater cash reserves, and having greater capital market access, are also in a position to fund acquisition sprees to buy up smaller or weaker competitors where those opportunities might exist and look attractive. So earlier speakers also mentioned shortages and disruptions, including in a variety of critical essential supplies. Barack noted the likely de-emphasis of a focus of antitrust on just price and quantity. I think part of what this all tells us is another lesson for how we do antitrust in normal times, which is we have a systematic shortcoming in our analysis of efficiencies. We allow firms to come in and talk to us about how their behavior, perhaps their acquisition, is going to reduce the costs by, facilitating economies of scale or other economies of concentrating activity. But that analysis very rarely considers something I might call resiliency or flexibility, the ability to expand and diversify supply sources and supply chains. And efficiencies of large consolidation may in fact be diseconomies when properly viewed. I think meatpacking is an example of that. So the second thing that we might worry about is losing the next generation of competitors. That, as has been noted, small and mid-sized companies in many sectors are particularly vulnerable to the present economic downturn. And they typically have much less access to capital markets, and the liquidity boost that the Fed has provided in the US isn't really helping them much, it's not trickling down much. So if we've got small and mid-sized companies more likely to exit, fewer new entrants into most markets during the pandemic and its near-term aftermath, that may mean fewer young firms. And we know that younger firms tend to be very important for innovation and economic growth over the long haul. So if we don't have young firms and we're missing a generation, the effect may not be immediately apparent, but could have long-term impacts on competition. The final thing I want to pick up on that's been mentioned throughout by all of the panelists is this concern about whether temporary collaborations that are permitted or facilitated during the crisis potentially having much longer term effects. So there's a temptation during crisis to replace the messiness of markets with more orderly responses. I'm not personally certain that the economics would bear out the success of that strategy, though it is definitely a tempting strategy. And in some cases, it may make sense. And as has been noted, that's led to antitrust blessing of cooperative ventures for what appear to be pro-social goals across countries, across markets. As Eleanor mentioned, sometimes in areas like healthcare or agriculture where we might be concerned about pre-existing market power. What I want to highlight is that what we've seen in studies of temporary antitrust immunity and then responses of that sector going forward is that firms can learn to collude during those periods of collaboration. And then even once you've removed the exemption, continue that anti-competitive cooperation, we'll call it tacit collusion, forward. There's a really beautiful 2010 paper by Renee Kamita that shows that when the intra-Hawaiian airlines were given an antitrust exemption after 9/11 to coordinate capacity reductions to deal with the substantial decline in demand, that once that antitrust exemption was removed, fares remained very high until finally, a few years later, another carrier came into the market. But I think what we have to worry about in terms of our antitrust focus going forward is, particularly to look at places where these exemptions have been granted, what's going on in those markets? Are we really seeing a return to competition post-crisis? And I think while OK said, firms are all doing this legitimately, they're not just colluding, they're asking for permission. the ones we know about have asked for permission. We might want to look in other sectors where we could suspect that firms are succumbing to the temptation to collude off the books post-crisis, and try to make sure that we're in fact enforcing our antitrust laws in those sectors as well. So thank you.
So we seem to have covered a lot of ground. I hope that we can put up all of the speakers. So that we can have a bit of a discussion. Okay, great. So thank you all for covering the world and covering all of our issues. I've learned that that we have a cappuccino economy in certain places. I'm trying to avoid bad jokes about things roll on like toilet paper, but in any event, so in listening to everyone, one of my reactions is that this plays out a little differently depending on where you sit. So I was struck, okay, by your notion that the firms in the UK really, felt that they couldn't move unless they had some antitrust exemption. Whereas I think in the US, I don't sense that that's the view. In fact, there aren't a lot of business review letter requests, so far as I can tell from the Justice Department, some, but not a huge amount. Justice Department did, and the FTC issue some broad statement about antitrust enforcement. But so I think there is that difference. There's also the difference that Eleanor mentioned, that to some extent antitrust is more of a proactive sword in certain areas that people are concerned about, particularly exploitation. So the South African case involving the price gouging of face masks, this is a result that apparently in the US we feel we can't use the antitrust laws for. And also what I hear is that we have, there are two time frames that we're worried about. There's a short-term time frame, how do we cope with next week? How do we cope with immediate problems? And then the longer term impact, which I think everyone talked about, but Nancy in particular, how will this affect the economy in a more long-term sense? One question that I have in listening to this is the problem identification issue. So is what this crisis, particularly the COVID crisis, which we're focused on mostly, is it a market failure issue? Do markets not work here? Or do we really not have a market failure issue? Maybe what we should do is have let markets work it out approach. As the old phrase goes, don't just do something, stand there. Let the markets work it out. We are in the process of a major shift in our economy, which COVID may be pushing forward to digitization. So let's just let it rip. And if some firms are, as some commentators have said, not superstar firms, but zombie firms, so be it. So they go out or they're acquired. So I wonder if I could get reactions, and then I'm going to see what we have in the chat. So if anyone has any reactions about problem identification and whether the best result would be for antitrust to let the markets work. We stop collusion, of course, when we find it, and pay attention to exclusionary behavior, but otherwise not alter what we do. So any reactions from the panelists? And you should unmute and just go. So I see, okay, we do have the We don't have the hand raising function. So, okay, then Eleanor, then Barack, then I'm sure Nancy. So go ahead.
Just in relation to the question, how you pose it on the identification of the problem, it is, I think there's an issue about what you think the market should do. I think underlying some of the discussion, particularly from Eleanor, was however we responded to the crisis ought to be fair. Okay, so there was an antitrust response, and is the response both to the provider and to consumers fair? So when you look at who survives in the marketplace, is it the strongest, the most innovative that are surviving, or is it those that are lucky in some sense? So there are particular structural unfairness. In the UK, we've got an issue with pubs, drinking establishment, bars. If you are a pub and you serve substantial meals, you may remain open. If you are what is known as a wet-led pub, mainly for drinking, you must close. There's nothing better or worse about either of these types of establishment, but some are going to survive because they've been able to remain open, and some are going to close because they don't serve food. And so it's just at the end, so at the clear out, why have the survivors survived? And why have those who have failed? To what extent is it possible for the strongest to come back into the marketplace? What are the mechanisms for this? But there's something about fairness in the solution, which I think underlies a lot of the debate.
So I'd like to take that one step further to the consumer rather than the producer. And the masks. At the beginning of the pandemic, when the price of masks, the South African case, the price of masks go up 888%. I was on a program in which James Hodge, who is the economist for the South African Commission, was also on. And someone said, why not let the market just work it out? There are only so many masks to allocate anyway. And if you let the market work it out and you let the sellers charge the high price, that will bring more masks into the market. And James Hodge said, in South Africa, that's not acceptable. That means the rich people live and the poor people die. So, period.
Apparently it's acceptable in the United States. So go ahead, Barack.
So as I said, I did a lot of work in another context. The issue of market disruption is one of the characteristics of the 21st century. So COVID just emphasizes that, but we will have much more. I mean, climate change will lead to climate change migration. We will have cybersecurity crisis. We'll have more pandemic. We'll have food shortage. So the key, I think that the more important thing is that actually we need a system prior to that, which is not competition policy. We need a regulatory system to reduce the cost of disruptions, which will come. And indeed, we have seen the disruption, large-scale disruption the pace, frequency, and cost have been growing dramatically over the past 25 years, and they will continue. So this is some kind of a lesson. I think that once we have a crisis, there are some, it's not let the market do the work. It depends on the context. I mean, it could be a little bit more nuanced. In some areas, perhaps it's good. In some areas, it's not that good. So I'll stop here.
So Nancy, sorry.
Yeah, could I jump in on that? So,
yeah.
You know, it's as a regulatory economist, it's very interesting to think about Barack's regulatory encouragement. And I do think in some ways, there's a question of not just, should we have the market or not? I think it's what is well left to the market, but what underpinnings might we need to ensure that the market is delivering the appropriate values. And so maybe some of this relates to the kind of fairness considerations that Eleanor mentioned. But I think about something like hospital beds, right? So in the US, there's been a decades-long push to make hospitals more efficient. And what does efficient mean? It means that your capacity matches your utilization. So you have very little excess capacity. That may work well 95% of the time when you don't have a pandemic or even a regional outbreak of some problem, or perhaps a catastrophic either accident or terrorist attack or whatnot that jams hospitals. But if we think that there is value as a society to having some spare capacity so that we can more easily flex, that's probably not something the market's going to provide for us, because the returns are too far out, too uncertain, and it's not clear that if I, in my hospital, have that spare capacity, that you're not going to benefit from it. And so I bear the cost and you bear the benefits. And so I think that's something where we've stepped so far back from just like, the market will figure out everything, that we're not always asking the question, well, where are markets not designed to get those answers right, or not likely to get those answers right?
So that's very interesting, because this is now posing this as a market failure and an institutional failure in some sense. I mean, Fred Kahn wrote a long time ago about option demand, and his example was how when he had to fly from Ithaca to Washington, and when the weather was bad, he took the train, and the conductor said, "Oh, our fair weather passengers. These are the people who expect the trains to be there for when it rains. Otherwise, they'll take the planes because it's cheaper." So how do we accommodate, do we have any institutional structures for accommodating that? So that may highlight, one of the questions is longer range post-pandemic, what sort of system do we see, institutional system? And that may highlight more of a move towards regulation, but how? Which is the puzzle. I mean, are we going to have, for hospital beds, are we going to have more hospital regulation? We haven't done so well with it now, which is, con regulation has restricted the number of hospitals we have, and we've allowed hospitals to merge. One of the questions on the chat was, as the economy comes back, in the chat it was roaring back, or something back, what do we expect of antitrust enforcement? Are we going to be, will it be more active? Will we be faced with an ever more concentrated economy through mergers? Should Congress have passed a statute putting a moratorium on mergers in certain industries until the pandemic passed, so that we wouldn't just have 5 companies? I include Microsoft in those 5 companies ruling us. So I wonder if people in the panel have views on what antitrust enforcement should look like as the economy returns. Those pubs have failed in the UK that weren't allowed to stay open. Small business has gone out a lot with a possible uptick in bankruptcies. Nancy, as you said, we haven't seen but might. Retail has changed enormously as people, if you can get used to collusion, you can get used to buying online, I've discovered. People learn. Things are going to change quite a bit. It almost, as I was thinking about this, it almost makes the cases that have been filed against Facebook seem quaint. It's, maybe that's, so 20th century. I don't know. So reactions on what antitrust enforcement might look like from the panel, and, and also there's another question to consider, maybe what we've experienced is more failure of government policy than markets during the crisis. Sort of goes, I think, to what OK is saying about how we've handled it. So Nancy, go ahead.
So I'd just like to jump in by saying, before the crisis hit, many of us thought we needed more assertive antitrust enforcement. There is no reason to think that that has become less important with the crisis. If anything, I think it's likely to become more important. And I think particularly in the US, which has not assertively enforced against anti-competitive conduct, we should be taking a much, much more serious, in-depth look at conduct post-crisis, because I think that's a place where we knew we had problems before, But some of the responses to crisis may make that worse. And in particular, I would say, you know, if firms exit, there's not much antitrust can do. We can enforce against acquisitions that reduce competition, and we should be aggressive there. But the other thing we ought to be doing is, if dominant firms are enhancing, maintaining, reinforcing their dominance by anti-competitive conduct, we ought to be going after that aggressively.
Yeah, Barack, and then, okay.
Just to add to what Nancy said, so we were in a similar situation in World War II, that the United States got into the World War II with Thurman Arnold, that there was a belief that antitrust should change, and that vanished in World War II. And I think that Nancy is absolutely right. There's no reason to think that there will not be, the pressures will not continue. They will continue. The problem is whether they'll continue in the right direction. I think that much of the discourse is a little bit overly simplistic. And there's just one point that I'd like to add. Nancy focused on mergers. The capital markets have been booming. So actually, in terms of tech, small tech companies, access to capital there's no better time than now. IPO markets booming. So again, what we do see is that there's a different, we see a technological divide, that in certain sectors of economics, things are really, really bad. Other sectors, things are fantastic. How do we address these inequalities? I'm not so sure that antitrust is the right venue.
Yeah, okay.
So I would just say, I suppose the question is whether a return to normal is good enough. Picking up on Nancy's writing, that normal actually wasn't that good. I suppose we're 10 years into thinking about how we might intervene or respond to Google. And we're probably 5 to 10 years away from actually responding to Google. And so I would say that perhaps after the crisis, what the crisis showed that was agencies can react quite quickly. But the response to perhaps the crisis in the economy, ordinarily called, is that agencies don't react quickly enough. And so I think in the more normal world, I think a certain change that we should be expecting is more rapid response. Now, what that might mean is a change in the standard of intervention. I don't know what the golden standard is that must be met before there might be some intervention. People have analyzed there to be a problem. And perhaps we sit around and just wander around looking at the problem like Rome burning, but saying, well, I'm not sure if this is going to put the fire out. So let's not try this until we can be sure that this is going to solve the problem. We should do nothing. And then we can just watch the problem and see it getting bigger and better. Perhaps an example I would give is Tony Blair, our former prime minister, was busy on the radio, appeared to be the key proponent of the only one jab of a 2-jab vaccine and the using vaccines before their efficacy had been determined. He appeared to be saying, we've got some vaccines and they've been proven to be safe. It doesn't really matter whether they're 20% effective, 50% effective, or 70% effective. You need to roll them out now. And he was the lead advocate of this. We don't think we're harming, but we think these strategies have some mechanism, or there's some means of assisting the problem. We don't know how much they're going to assist, but they're not overly costly interventions, and they might make the situation better. But we acknowledge a problem, and perhaps some of those lessons should be taken into the antitrust arena.
Eleanor, do you want to burn Rome down and just watch it? Go ahead.
Oh, just to say, I agree with my fellow panelists, and I think post crisis, there will be more crises. There may be more crises like these. We're on a track. If there's no legislation, we have a very, very conservative court. Yes, Harry, Facebook might be looking quaint. Google might be looking quaint. The two aspects are going in different directions. We need more aggressive enforcement. There is a trend towards more concentration in exactly the concentrated areas, towards more use of leverage and monopoly power that they can probably maneuver, thread the needle through the Trinco conduct that is not a violation. And unless there's legislation, there will be conservative antitrust.
Well, we're almost out of time. It's always easier, okay, to tell people that they can do things rather than to try to stop people from doing things. So the interventions, one thing that I like to end with as a question for next year, will it be more antitrust or more regulation? Where will that Google case be next year? That's it. We're finished. Thank you very much, panel. Appreciate it.
Thank you.